This is Shawn.
Hey, we have a guest today.
Yes.
Today we have Thomas Duvernay, PhD, joining us. Been wanting to have you on for a long time. Welcome to the show.
We have.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Good. Yeah. We've talked about this, having you on. It has been a couple of years, and we wanted to do it right around this time because, of course, this is the coming up on the anniversary time of the event. That's the historic event that's a key part of your research and your studies. Mm-hmm. And we always wanted to do the episode during the month of the anniversary of the event. And we always ended up missing the anniversary. And then I said to Joe, I was like, we missed it again. I said, okay, next year. Let's get in touch with Thomas and ask him. And then
everyone's going to guess, what is the event? Okay, we're in June. Let's see. The 2010 Gay Pride Parade.
The summer solstice.
That's what it was.
No.
Okay. All right.
Aji. No. So, but so we are going to talk about what I think is a very interesting historic event and something that's not so very well known, maybe, and not so compared to a lot of other events in Korean history, especially with the pop culture that kind of overshadows everything else in Korean history and culture and folklore and things like that. Mm. But a very important event. So the Shinmiyangyo. But we'll get into that a little bit more. But Thomas, first, would you like to tell everyone a little bit about you?
Okay, well, as been said, my name is Thomas Duvernay. I'm originally from the state of Michigan in the United States. I first came here to Korea in 1984.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been a few years. And back then, I was teaching in a Korean high school, and that's actually where I met my wife. She was the high school science teacher, and we got married that same year. Mm-hmm. And later on that year, we moved back to Michigan, and she went on to work on her graduate studies, and I ended up teaching at a college in my home state. Very, very different from what I'm teaching now. Back then, I taught industrial technology.
Oh.
Oh,
yeah,
cool.
Yeah. It's industrial technology and electronics. I taught. So a little bit different from what I'm teaching today. So yeah, I taught there for a few years. And then the opportunity came up for me to come back to Korea and teach in a Korean college. And so that was in 1989. My wife and our then young son and we packed up and came back to Korea. Mm-hmm. And I was teaching at a college there. Now it was only supposed to be for a year. We were actually.
Yes, I've heard this before.
You've heard, yeah. We were originally. It was supposed to be. We were just coming back for a year, so my wife could, have a little bit of time back in her culture and such. And it's been one of those things that, well, in the past, what is that? 36 years now. Mm-hmm. Since returning to Korea, that every year I ask her, well, is my year up yet?
Yes.
And she always smiles and says, no, not yet.
Not yet.
So I was going to ask, how high does she roll her eyes when you say that?
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. Yeah. So as I say, we returned in 89 and taught college, and then I went over to teach at the Gyeongju campus of Dongguk University. And I taught there for, I don't know, what was that, about 15 years almost.
Wow.
Yeah. Then I taught for a few years over at Handong Global University in Pohang. And then for the last 16 years, I've been here in Gyeongsan at Yeongnam University
Mm.
teaching. So been all over the place here
All over.
a
Been
little
quite busy.
bit.
And what are
Yeah,
you teaching? What are you teaching now?
I teach English.
You teach English. I
Um,
see. Mhm.
yeah, I actually both at Handong and also for several years here at Yeongnam, I also taught Korean history.
Okay. Right. Right.
Um, but here at Yeongnam, there uh, that the program that I was teaching under kind of went away,
Mm,
as sometimes things tend to do in Korean
mm,
Oh,
institutions.
that happened to my
mm,
major when I was in college. Kind of went away.
mm,
Yeah, just
mm,
yeah, kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
mm.
I mean, it was fun while I did it. I loved it. I mean, it was really great. Most of my students were international students. That's what that class had been designed for, was teaching international students Korean history. Even though I did have many Korean students who joined in with it. It was really fun and spirited. We had great discussions on historical topics, and uh, yeah. But the for the last several years, just teaching English.
Okay. Yeah. Good. So now, but teach history, of course, is a big love of yours, and
Oh,
archery as well. I know.
absolutely,
I know
absolutely.
archery is also a big love of yours,
Hmm.
and I do know that your love of archery, and I know from reading your book, your love of archery kind of led to your interest in the topic today. I
Yes,
remember you.
that is correct.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. So just quickly, yeah. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that, like how you got into, how your interest grew in the Shinmiyangyo, and we'll just say just very briefly, because I would like to hear you describe
Yeah. What is it
this event
first?
actually is,
Because
but just briefly as an incident. It was a military incident between the United States and Chosun in 1871. So that's the basics of it.
Yeah.
But how did your, I'd like to hear more about it, of course, from you to describe it, but how did you first get interested in the this incident?
Okay, well, as you mentioned, I started practicing Korean traditional archery back in 1993,
Mm,
and uh, I found it really fascinating, especially because archery is very historically rooted in Korean culture and history,
mm,
and as somebody who had always been interested in history, I started doing my own little private research. At that time, I was only, I guess, say, an amateur historian, just somebody who was interested in it, but didn't do anything really academically at the time.
mhm.
But I found that, or I had this thought in my mind that, okay, all right, Korean traditional archery. I was kind of wondering, when would have been the last time that the bow in Korea was used militarily?
And Korea has a
And
unique type of bow, doesn't it?
yeah. Traditionally, there's the one. It's the Korean hornbow, the gakgung.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
It looks like the horns of a big steer, like a big bull.
yeah. Well, when it's
Yeah.
unstrung, yeah, when it's
Yeah.
unstrung,
Yeah.
it'll do that. But it has the Korean hornbow, the belly, which is the part that's facing the person. The belly has water buffalo horn on it,
Ah.
and yeah, the core is bamboo. It's backed with sinew and all held together with fish air bladder glue.
Mm.
Um, all kinds of materials go together. It takes 1 year to make one of those, but
Yeah.
that'll have to be for another
yeah,
podcast,
that's
Okay.
right.
Okay.
Yeah,
because
There's a
that
really
that
good
that,
there's a
that
really
that's
good
another
TED
one
talk about
we
that.
could go on for a long time
Yeah.
about that. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, they have a very somewhat unique bow. I mean, there are other cultures that have similar.
Hmm.
mhm,
But anyway, uh, I I was just curious about when the last time the bow was used militarily, and I had heard this story. I don't know, somebody had mentioned it, or maybe I read it somewhere. To be honest, I don't quite remember. But about that, the United States had a military dust up with Korea back in the 19th century. And so I thought, well, maybe the bow was used then. So that's when I started looking into it to see what I could find. Back then, when I was, this is, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. Back then, there's not much in the way of source material,
right?
About it. Even Korean source material was nearly non-existent. And what there was very heavily propagandized.
I was waiting for that word.
Well, you got it. Yeah. Well, hey, countries do that, and
we do that.
That's
their national myth. Yeah.
And so that's when I started checking in with NARA in the United States, the National Archives and Records Administration.
Oh.
And so I was trying to see what information they had on it. And they actually sent me a fairly thick packet of things. Wow. And it was really kind of the U.S. propagandized material. As they said, everybody does it.
Everyone does it.
Yeah, but they also had sent some photocopied photos from 1871 that were originally taken by the photographer Felice Beato, and that really got my interest. Like, wow, this is interesting. I was looking through their photocopies of the original photos, and so then I started checking further with them and said, are these photos available? And at that time they said, well, yeah, you can buy negative copies. So I bought a whole set of negatives of those photos, and back then you could easily go to a photo store and have things printed up, and
right,
which I did, and I just got so drawn into the story itself that I kind of forgot why I originally got into it, because of the archery aspect. But I did find out one thing, which was the Korean bow was not used in the 1871 fight. Even though the bow in Korea remained a military weapon until the reform of 1894. Which is when it was officially retired as a military weapon here in Korea. But I thought that, this story is interesting in itself. So I just, any kind of information I could find, I was grabbing. I looked, into old magazine articles, anything that anybody had written at any point in time. I even tried to find descendants of people involved, in which I did have some success in some years later. And I just found it to be such a fascinating story that I just had to know more. And it along with the Korean archery is what really drew me to become a historian of Korean history.
Interesting. Yeah. So first, did you find out the last time the bow was used in military conflict?
Well, it may have actually been, I'm, going to really qualify that one. 5 years earlier in 1866, when the French were here, in the 병in양yo.
Right.
Now, just to, people might even wonder what these Yangyos are all about. The Shinmiyangyo means the Western disturbance in the Shinmi year, which was 1871. And the 병인양요 is the Western disturbance of the Byungin year, which was 1866.
Right.
So yeah, that's where the names come from. And the reason I say it may have been used in 1866 is because there was a French officer of family name of Joubert, and he was an artist, and he made lots of drawings, and he made a drawing of a Korean soldier with a bow.
Mm-hmm.
So it is possible that it was used. I don't have any historical information that really says that. But one thing I would say is that since the what was called the Imjin Weiran, which was the Imjin War between Hideyoshi Japan and Korea back in 1592 to 98,
right?
The bow that was kind of the zenith for the bow and military here in Korea, because of course the Japanese brought in firearms,
Mm-hmm.
Right?
which really, in some ways, made the bow rather obsolete in many ways. And so after that, the bow was still a military weapon, as I said, until 1894, but it was kind of relegated to secondary, probably at best. They kept bows on hand. People were still trained to use them militarily, but you don't really hear too much past the Imjin Weiran of the bow really being used militarily.
Oh, interesting. So just a backup, essentially.
Yeah.
Right. Just in case.
Run
right.
out of ammo, you pull your bow out of your back pocket.
Pull your bow.
Little John Wick action.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is that, and I've thought about this over the years, is that in actuality, if the Koreans had used a bow in the Shinmiyangyo, they probably would have been a little more successful.
Huh.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I think there probably would have been more American casualties if they had. The reason for that is the Koreans were using matchlock muskets, which the matchlock muskets, they are muzzle loading, smoothbore weapons that take time to load and reload.
Right.
And actually, even though your podcast listeners won't see this, but this is a Korean matchlock musket ball from the Shinmiyangyo.
Oh, from the incident itself.
This was one that was fired in that action there.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's about 45 caliber.
Yeah. Don't lose that in your peanut bowl.
No. Yeah. That would not be a fun thing.
It looks like it totally could camouflage itself in there.
Yeah, it probably could. But anyway, it took time to load. Matchlock muskets, they were fired with a burning match cord, and they weren't always reliable.
Right. I mean, you had to light them. Those are used in the U.S. in the American Revolution. Those types of. Well.
They in the American Revolution, yeah, you had smoothbore.
Right, smoothbore, which means like
muskets.
It wasn't corkscrew shaped where the
rifle.
The ball could put a spin on it, make it go faster.
Right. Yeah. So
see, I watch
anyway.
Mythbusters.
Yeah. So anyway, they were slow. They were inaccurate, especially compared to what the Americans had. The Americans, the naval forces. There's you had sailors and Marines who had much more modern weaponry that were rifled.
More like what you see in cowboy movies, I would say. Yeah.
As a matter of fact.
There we go. That's a bullet.
Yeah. Well, this is the cartridge. Now, actually, it's kind of it's interesting. This one here is actually it's 50 caliber, and this was a dropped cartridge. The actual bullets themselves look like this.
Wow. Yeah.
And this is what the sailors had. The Marines, however, had something a little bit closer to what the Koreans had. The Marines, they were using muzzle loading rifles that were Civil War era. So they had bullets that looked like this.
A little fatter.
This is a .577 caliber mini ball, they were called. And this one here is a 69 caliber
little
mini
bigger
ball.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, Thomas, just to interject for a minute.
Sure.
When was the American? You said the Civil War, so I know
which was 1861 to 1865.
Okay, yeah, right.
So it was the decade earlier.
Sure. Right.
You could ask me that. I grew up in Alabama. That's born into your from grade school.
Yeah. Sometimes I also tend to not remember that. So some people might not be quite as clued into it as some folks are.
Yeah. So I wanted to get the age because you said it was Civil War. So it was the decade before. So yeah. So they were a bit older. But
but the sailors were armed with Remington rolling block carbines, which were the ones that were these 50 caliber, the 50 caliber cartridges that they used, which were really the carbines were really easy to load, very fast. I in the States I own a few of them.
Wow.
Well, I like to be hands-on with things. I also own in the States. I have to in the States. Korea does not.
We don't have.
Korea tends to frown on ownership of those things here. But I always like to try things out. I like a hands-on approach to history.
Wow.
And so when I tried shooting one of the carbines, I was able to get up to 9 rounds in a minute.
Whoa, that's okay. Okay.
Well, for an old guy like me, that's okay. I mean, when you think that back then the sailors, this is something that they had to do for their life. Some of them were quite a bit faster than I was. Now, when it comes to the muzzle loaders, like the Marines had, which were they had the Springfield M1861s, and also there were the ones that were called the Whitneyville Plymouths. Those are the 69 caliber. Being muzzle loaders, they might get three or maybe 4 shots in a minute, maybe if they're really fast. But when you get into battle conditions, all of that tends to go out the window. And if you get maybe 1 or 2 shots in a minute, you're with all the nerves that you're having, you're probably fairly lucky. Yeah. So anyway, the reason why going back to what I was originally saying, the reason why I think the Koreans would have been better off if they were using bows and arrows is because you can get quite a few arrows off in a minute.
Right.
Maybe
skilled archer, yeah.
And Koreans for distance, in Korean traditional archery, we're shooting at 145 meters.
Wow.
And fairly accurately. So if a trained Korean archer, a foot archer, is shooting, I'm sure they would be able to be right on point if they were aiming at a lot of the American troops. So that's why I say I think they might have fared a little better if instead of their matchlock muskets.
Right. Interesting.
So what are the incidents? Okay, you can ask the questions.
No. Go ahead. Yep. So
what was leading up to this skirmish?
Okay. All right. Well, as most skirmishes begin, politics are generally involved. And this one was no different. Actually, for years, the American government wanted to interact with Korea.
Right.
Especially for possible trade,
Right.
maybe having diplomatic and trade relations with Korea.
Yeah. After Matthew
China
Perry.
was already in the mix for a long time. Japan
Yeah.
was already there for a couple of decades.
Yeah.
And so Korea was kind of a missing puzzle piece in a way. So
it was the flyover of Asia. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and of course, as has been seen by history and such, Korea is a bridge between mainland Asia and countries like Japan. So it was really quite important. And the United States wasn't the only country that wanted to do things here in Korea. Everybody wanted to. And the United States thought, well, maybe we can get some trade relations going with them. Let's see. Now, there were precursors to this, as we said, 1866,
French,
with the French, and which did not go very well
Nope.
for either side, actually, especially the French. And the French sailed away with Joseon's archives, which came back just in the last several years. There were also other things that happened. For instance, there was the very one that is always talked about is the ship, the General Sherman. Say in that same year, 1866. Now, one thing I do have to mention about that is that many people try to tie 1871 to the General Sherman, and that's really not completely accurate. People in 1871 knew about the General Sherman. There were ships that came just a few years earlier trying to ascertain what exactly happened to it. But you see, the General Sherman was it itself was a civilian-owned ship that had been a military ship during the American Civil War, but it was sold into to a civilian corporation, and
it was burned down, wasn't it?
Well, it was. It had a crew of, I think there's like about 24 crew members, mostly Southeast Asian and Chinese.
I was just saying that if it was burned down, the irony of it being called the General Sherman.
Yeah.
Because he's known for burning down cities.
All right, all right, okay. I'm a little slow today. But yeah, you're right. But anyway, it was considered actually by most, and even the United States government recognized it as little more than a pirate ship. In many ways, because it was armed, and it went up the Daedong River to Pyongyang in now present day North Korea, and got hung up on a sandbar when it was trying to get out. And it was firing upon the civilians of Pyongyang, and that didn't really sit well with them. And just as you said, the soldiers and civilians, they sent out burning boats that caught fire on General Sherman and burned it to the waterline. Its occupants jumped out and either drowned or were killed by the populace.
They were drowned on a sandbar?
Well, there was still water there.
They jumped off the wrong part.
Well, some of them probably, the ones who probably were able to get to the dry land, they were the ones who probably wish they hadn't. And to the Koreans, it was like, this is unacceptable. And after that happened, a few years after, the Americans sent ships to find out what happened to it. Um, and they were just told, eventually they got the information about it. But at first they were trying to go through the Chinese, and the Chinese really didn't want to get involved. But they did reluctantly do what they could. And the United States knew what it was all about. The government did. And so that's why I say, some people say, well, the United States came back to punish Korea in 1871. No, that's not the case at all. Now, was the General Sherman mentioned at all during when they met with the Koreans? I don't know. It's possible something, but I doubt it, because the Americans already knew pretty much what had happened. The Americans came to Korea ostensibly to get a treaty to protect shipwrecked mariners, and also a possible trade treaty. That's what they wanted, But of course, they were also armed because they were military, and that's what military does. And the thing is that when they met with the Koreans, the Korean envoys that came to them, first, the envoys were not of a sufficient rank to do negotiations. And so the minister plenipotentiary to China, Frederick Lowe, he would not meet with the emissaries because they weren't high enough in rank. So he had his secretary meet with them, and his secretary was basically telling them, all right, what they'd like to do. We'd like to send a survey party up the Salt River, the Yamha, the Ganghwa Straits, just to check for possible future trade relations or something. And then the Koreans said nothing. They were silent.
This was when Hung Sung Daewon-gun was in power, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, because he had a very big isolationist attitude.
Well, and I think many people would agree with good reason. 1866 was not a good year for relations between the West and Korea. And
he did kill a lot of Catholics, including French missionaries.
Yep. Yeah, it was. Both sides were not ingratiating themselves to each other.
Yeah.
But anyway, the Korean emissaries, they didn't say anything when the Americans said that they wanted to go up the straits, and the Americans took that to be that, okay, no objection. But in Korea, you have to actually have written permission to send a ship up the straits. Even Korean fishermen had to have permits to go up the straits. And so on June 1st of 1871, when the Americans sent their survey crew up the straits, that was when Koreans fired upon them, and the Americans were like, why did you do that? And they said, well, you came into waters without permission. And that was kind of the start of it. And where it came from. The Americans wanted to have trade and everything, but through what I consider to be probably the first big cultural misunderstanding between the United States and Korea, ended in violence.
Yeah, they basically walked into the house with their shoes on.
Yes, yeah, that's probably an apt way to put it.
Yeah. And then what were then? So that's how it all started. So then, what were some of the key events then? And and then how long did it last? How long?
I went for context because a lot of our listeners aren't aware of the geography
right.
stuff. So Ganghwa is an island right to the west of, you say, Incheon, which is where the airport is, which is the west of Seoul.
Yeah, Ganghwa Island is actually just west of Gimpo.
Yay! That's where I am. Yeah, I can drive to Ganghwa easily. It's a day trip from Seoul.
Yeah. Oh, and many people do it. And
Beautiful
you have two ways you can do it nowadays: bridge on the north and a bridge on the south.
Both of them,
So from
both
Incheon
of them backed up
or
with traffic.
yeah, backed up with traffic. If you pick your days. But yeah, it's the Ganghwa Island is a very strategic island because it sits right at the mouth of the Han River,
Right.
which of course goes right down into Seoul. And so if you want to take your ship into Seoul, you have to go by Ganghwa Island. So
Right.
very, very strategic. And because it's right across, also the straits are right across from mainland Korea, that also makes it quite strategic. So it always has been a very heavily militarily protected area, very sensitive. When people ask me about, why did the Koreans fire him? I said, well, think about it. What if back then, same time, some other country sailing ship, military sailing ship, decides they're going to go up the Mississippi. The United States is just going to say, yeah, hey, come on in. No, I think there would probably be fireworks.
Right.
I think that goes without saying. Korea was and is a sovereign country, and if you go someplace in a sovereign country where you're not wanted, you're liable to be in trouble for doing so.
They might have been assuming that was open sea when Korea says, no, that's inside territory. Maybe.
Yeah.
I might speculate. The Americans were thinking they were kind of an open sea, like those types of rules when they were actually inside territory.
Yeah, and I guess one other thing is probably they just didn't really recognize sovereignty of countries here in Asia as Western countries tended to do back in those days.
Yeah.
It was like, well, you're an Asian country, and we're just going to look around a little bit.
Yeah, we got better guns.
Yeah, well, and of course that's one of the reasons why the Koreans said they fired upon. Said, look, you say you came in peace, and yet we see these we see these ships and boats going up our straits, heavily armed.
Yeah.
What are we to think?
Yeah, maybe it's a sneak attack, a public sneak attack.
Well, and as was found out several days later, that much in the way of what the Americans sent could do a lot of damage, and they did. Yeah, so just to kind of give a little more context, so June 1st was first shots. The Americans gave the Koreans 10 days to explain themselves and apologize.
Ooh, apologize. Korea loves
apologies.
Oh, yeah.
Now the Americans also had a little ulterior motives because the tides would be better for them at that time too. So they waited and waited to see, if the Koreans would respond to them. And at some point, just not long before the Americans launched their main attack up the straits, Koreans sent a raft down the straits that was filled with, it had on it oxen, chickens, and thousands of eggs. And with a note that basically said, you might be hungry on your way home.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Needless to say, the Americans did not take that as an apology. And so they said, now this attack is going forward. And the attack was supposed to be limited to the fortresses that fired upon the Americans on June 1st. Which actually it included the Choji forts that are at the southern end of Ganghwa Island. At that time, there were actually two forts there. One of them no longer exists. It's a sushi restaurant now.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there's the Dukjin fortresses that a couple miles north of that. and then the main fortress, which the main one's called Gwangsungbo, but the fort, the redoubt, shall we say, that actually did the fighting, has a couple of different names, but the main one that's known as today is the Sondolmok Fort, which sometimes confuses people because right across the straits there is the Sondol Myo,
Right.
the Sondol's tomb,
Right.
which is what everything is named after. You know, an ancient mariner from the Goryeo dynasty of Korea.
Mhm.
And so it sometimes kind of confuses people. They hear about the Sondol Mok. Now, Sondol Mok actually seems to be meaning like a throat mok,
Mm.
whereas that's where the rapids of the straits wind around that peninsula,
Mm.
and the currents get really fast at that point. So that's where it seems to come up with the Sondol Mok. Anyway, the little fortress, which is about 30 meters in diameter, so not really huge, but that's where the Koreans made their last stand. And they you had probably about, well, there were estimated, it could have been maybe a couple thousand Korean troops in total on the island at that time, against, there were 1,200 American troops that were sent ashore. Or I shouldn't, yeah. Well, no, there were 1,200 actually total, I should say. There were
Mhm.
about 600 or so that were actually sent ashore. You had 500 sailors and 100 Marines. And the Americans went up the straits with 2 gunboats, because the straits, are very, very shallow, relatively speaking. And so the main ships that the Americans had 5 ships. 3 were large wooden vessels and 2 gunboats. The wooden vessels were the USS Colorado, which was their flagship, the USS Alaska, and the USS Benicia. Those were the 3 wooden ships. The gunboats, you had, the main one was the USS Monocacy, which was a double-ended gunboat, and the USS Palos, which was a converted tugboat into a gunboat. So they were able to navigate the straits along with cutters and whaleboats and other things like that. And they were fitted with a lot of armament, so they were able to give support to all the American troops that went ashore against these forts that had fired on them. So,
Interesting. Mm.
so
And
that
then,
that's
mm.
kind of
I'm sorry, go
kind
ahead.
of started. No, and just that's how everything was kind of set up.
Mm.
Mm.
Mm. Right. And so it all led, essentially it kicked off because of some misunderstandings, the
Yeah,
intentions,
kind of a big
and
misunderstanding. Yeah.
yeah, right. And then also, yeah, lack of communication, a communication breakdown, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty serious one.
Actually, little to no communication.
Okay, right. Okay. Lack of communication, right. Not a breakdown, a lack of, right. Okay. And then how did it conclude? How did everything, and how
All
long
right.
was it? How long was the fighting? And then how did everything come to an end?
Well, the attack started the morning of June 10th. That was when all the ships went up the Ganghwa Straits, and as they passed some, there were some minor fortifications that were south of, like, the Choji forts, and the Americans fired into them, but there was no reply, so they were evidently abandoned. A former colleague of mine actually found a ground exploded shell in one of those fortresses, and it very well could have been the opening shot, which I always found kind of interesting. But anyway, they worked their way up the straits, and then they got to the Choji Fortress, and the gunboats did their work firing on that fortress and driving the few defenders, Korean defenders that were in there at the time, out. And then they made way for landing. So then they were landing the sailors and Marines in many boats that were pulled to shore. And one interesting thing I find about their landing is where they landed today is reclaimed land, and it's grain fields now. But back then it was their shoreline that went in back of the Choji fortresses. But anyway, the Americans got as close as they could, which wasn't close enough for them, unfortunately, because when the sailors and Marines got out of their towed boats, they sunk up to their thighs in sticky mud, which anyone who's been to Ganghwa can attest to. There's still a lot of it there.
Yeah, that whole area.
And then they had to haul with them their all their artillery pieces. They had 7 artillery pieces that they took with them. They were boat howitzers that could be put onto their like their cutters and such, and then transferred to a field carriage on shore. So they had to haul those to shore. So it took them a good short share of the day just to get ashore. Many of the guys who were going ashore lost their shoes, gaiters, and even trousers. I have to imagine that Korean scouts who were watching this probably were laughing themselves silly. But eventually the force did get everything onto dry land, and the Marines and sailors went to work trying to dismantle the Choji fortresses. And then they also set up a nighttime camp just a few hundred meters in back of the Choji fortresses, where they would have their main camp for the night. Marines went a little bit north, about maybe a third of a mile north of the main camp, and they set up their outpost, which the hill is still there. It's really kind of interesting to see where they camp for the night. And so they set up their picket lines and everything to for any kind of sneak attack at nighttime that the Koreans might do, and the Koreans tried. Right around midnight, the Koreans tried attacking the Americans, and the Marines fired on the attackers, and also they fired their howitzers, and it was a very short-lived attack, and nothing much happened the rest of that night. The next morning, after the drums beat reveille for everybody, they got up really early. The sailors finished their job of dismantling the fortresses, and then everybody got into formation to start heading towards the Dukjin fortresses. And it took them time to get there, and most of the landing force stayed at what is right now a literal crossroads. There's roads that cross themselves right at the bottom of the Dukjin fortresses, and that's where most of the American forces waited, while the Marines went up the hill to do their own dismantling of the Dukjin fortress. And they took Felice Beato followed them, the photographer on that day. He was really having a, on June 11th, he was really having a literal field day of this. And so he took a really famous photo of Marines lining the top of the Dukchin Fortress. And the Koreans there were no Koreans there, but their breakfast fires were still burning. So they had been there. The Marines rejoined the sailors, and then they were now heading on their way towards their main objective of Gwanghwasunbo. And at this point, they started following the ridge line, and so they had to haul their artillery pieces up and down these ridges, and they established one of these hills. They put some of their artillery on this one hill to guard the troops who were going to be passing it. And it was kind of interesting because when I was doing my field research, we found a lot of evidence of the Americans having been there and their artillery having been there. So that was kind of interesting.
Cool.
Yeah. Matter of fact, I actually, like for instance, right here, that is actually what's called a water cap for a fuse on for an artillery shell.
Mm-hmm.
This was for a 5-second fuse. So it was, to protect the fuse against water damage and such. Mm-hmm. And I found that on that first artillery hill. I thought that one was kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And then when, the artillery set up there on the first hill, and then the infantry, the sailors and Marines went ahead towards a second hill. And this next hill, which I always call Artillery Hill 2, it overlooks not only where the Americans came from, but it also shows where they were going to. So it overlooks right over into the main fortress of the Sondomok Fortress. And so they set up their second artillery position there. And then the infantry kept on going, and they kind of split up into two different groups. You had Marines going one direction, most likely towards the right of the fortress, and you had the sailors going towards the left of the fortress. And then the Marines ended up probably only about 40 meters or so from the fort when they finally got to where they were going. Their first stop was maybe about 100 meters away, but then they worked their way up a little bit more to where they were 40 meters away. Now, you may wonder how I know that. And that was, again, my former colleague who also helped on a lot of this research and field research and such. He found many little deposits of these .577 caliber mini balls that the Marines had, and he found them deposited in little piles and evenly spaced where he found them. And that's because the Marines, they would have taken their positions there waiting, and just for speed, they would have taken many of their paper cartridges, which had the powder and each of these mini balls, and they would put them right next to them so they could reach them easily and reload. But of course, when the attack came, they weren't going to be gathering them all up or anything. They just got up and did their attack at that point. So that's how we were able to point where the Marines were positioned. And then likewise, I was able to personally ascertain where the sailors were by similar methods. For instance, if here with a whole cartridge, that would have been a drop, and possibly it might have been where a sailor put his little pile of Remington rolling block cartridges to right next to him. And then also there were many of the brass where they were,
Right.
and you can even see where the pin struck.
Pin, right. Interesting.
And so, that was kind of showing where the forces were located before the main attack. And so when both the Marines and the sailors got to their positions, they rested mainly. They tried to stay behind the brow of the hill because the sailors did, because the Koreans were madly trying to shoot at them with their matchlocks.
Yeah.
And it's where it's actually where I found not only completely round matchlock balls, but even ones that have been flattened.
Right. They hit something.
They hit something.
Yeah.
So the Koreans are firing at them. Most of the time, however, because of the distance, probably about 120, 150 meters away, the sailors were. The energy in their musket balls really had decreased. And so that's why I was able to find a lot of these right near the surface, because they just kind of landed. But anyway, the Americans still kept out of sight as much as possible, but they would get up and they would, anytime a Korean showed himself above what was left of the walls, the fortress walls, because the walls were being demolished by the artillery, not only the American artillery ashore, but also the artillery that was on the USS Monocacy. The USS Monocacy, it had some really heavy artillery for the time. It had 2 9-inch shell guns, which would hurl an 80-pound explosive shell. And it also had a 60-pound parrot rifle. So that was a rifled piece, and which could be very, very accurate shooting. So the Americans were able to take the walls down. So there you just had kind of like rubble and dirt by this time that the Americans had to contend with. So anytime a Korean showed himself above that little ridge, the Americans picked him off, and quite easily with their rifled pieces. They were fairly accurate. But then at a certain point, signal was given for the artillery to stop firing. And at this point, there were already some Americans, some sailors who had positioned themselves at the bottom of the hill by this time. And then when the signal was given, they charged up the hill. And because of the slope of the hill, the Koreans couldn't really get the angle they needed with their matchlocks. And not only that, but the Americans were coming so fast, the Koreans didn't have time to really reload or anything. So the Koreans ended up throwing things at the Americans, rocks and sticks and dirt and whatever else they could get their hands on. Well, there's a lot of rubble, so they were pitching that down for sure. But the Americans came up with fairly fast rapidity. Kind of redundant there. Yeah, that just shows how fast they were.
Was it really fast?
Anyway, they got up to the top, and now this is kind of the interesting thing, and there were 3 Americans who were killed in this action.
Only 3.
3. There were 10 who were wounded severely, but there were only 3 who were killed. And the person who was in front of everybody, he was charging ahead of all the other troops, was Lieutenant Hugh Wilson McKee. He's a Navy lieutenant. And he was ahead of all. The guys couldn't keep up with him. He jumped over that ridge with his revolver in one hand and his sword in the other. he fired off a couple of rounds, and then a Korean inside the fortress shot him in the groin with his matchlock, and another one stuck him in the side with a spear. And needless to say, that kind of put him out of commission. But the other Americans were right behind him. As a matter of fact, as soon as he fell, there was Lieutenant Commander Schley, who came over the hill, and he shot the Korean who shot McKee. After the Korean tried to spear him too, but he was able to get the spear in between his elbow and his side, so the Korean couldn't move it, and then he shot him. And there was another sailor was killed. His name was Seth Allen. He was just an enlisted sailor. He was shot in the chest when he was trying to go over the hill. And then, but actually the first American who was actually killed was one of the Marines. And his name was Dennis Hanrahan. He was Private Dennis Hanrahan. He was actually from Ireland, Kilkenny, Ireland. He was very young, early 20s. And so in this case, literally the first quote American killed in Korea
it was an Irishman.
was an Irish Marine. And so yeah, those were the Americans killed. But right after all this all happened really, really quickly. You know, you might think of this battle, went on for hours. No, it was probably over in about 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. The Marines all attacked a lot, right after the sailors breached, the Marines were right behind them. And this is, where we kind of get into where the story really, really contracts. Because at this point you have the Korean General Jae-yun, and his brother. They were in there, and the general was right not too far from his flag. The Sujagi, the very, very large flag that denoted that this was the main fortress where everybody was gathering. And the Marines really gravitated to the general right away. So there was one of the Marines. He went up and bayoneted the general in the chest. The general he was swinging not only his sword, but he had actually picked up from what I had read, he actually had picked up a cannonball.
Oh my!
He was even trying to use that as a club.
Yeah, anything you can get your hands on. Yeah,
really, truly. But he was bayoneted. Everybody in there eventually was wounded or killed. The wounded really tried to commit suicide because they didn't want to be taken prisoner, but some of them just really weren't able to do so because the Americans were on them really, really quickly. But there was quite a fight. As I said, there were about 10 Americans who were severely wounded. A lot of slashes, even severe slashes to the head, spear wounds, things like that. But it was over fairly quickly, and a lot of the remaining troops who were able to, they took off in different directions. And there was one really kind of an interesting thing, and it's the story that I actually made for this. It's one of these things like, how can you put the story together type thing? And I'll show you just a second here. Nice to have my show and tell items, even if your podcast listeners can't see them.
Right.
Describe them. Well, again,
our Patreons can see them.
Patreons can see the videos.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
Well, I was out searching again with my former colleague, and he came across a really interesting with his metal detector, he got a really heavy iron signal on the side of a hill that was just below the path that leads up to that fortress. And so he started exploring that signal, and he came up with something that was really fascinating. And see, this is an iron canister shot.
Yeah.
And
Around the size
canister was
of a
canister
meatball.
was basically a tin can that was filled with these 1-inch iron balls,
Yeah.
and then it was attached to a wooden sabot, which was put into the cannon and fired. It turned your cannon into a very huge shotgun, is what it did.
Mm-hmm.
Now he found these. He found a couple dozen of these in a very, very tight circle, which means that the cannon that fired them couldn't have been very far away.
Right.
Because if any far away, and that would have spread really quickly. But these were in a very, very tight grouping, a cluster. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So I thought, well, I took my metal detector and I thought, well, let me see if I can find anything on the side of this hill anywhere. And I got a different signal. Mine came up with it was more of a really light metal signal, not a heavy iron signal. And I didn't dig around very long before I came up with this. And this is one of the 50 this is a 50 caliber bullet.
Yeah.
From a Navy Remington rolling block.
Uh-huh.
But the thing that at the time really got my curiosity were the indentations on one on either side there.
Yeah. Like
And at first it really didn't.
Looks like some bit on it. Yeah.
Well, at first it really didn't dawn on me. Then suddenly I was thinking, you know what? And then I was thinking about, yeah, this was a bite bullet. Exactly.
Ah.
So what does that mean?
Someone's getting amputated, they bite the bullet.
Oh, exactly.
Oh, interesting.
So, and it was found only about 2 meters from this cluster.
Oh.
So this is where my story made itself in my brain box here. Was that there was a Korean, because the American historical record tells about Koreans running down that trail trying to get away. Mm-hmm. And I imagine that the Americans, they had one of their howitzers on that end, which would have been, strategically a good thing to do. And they probably saw these guys running away, and they probably very quickly turned their howitzer without aiming and just fired it off. Mm-hmm. And whereas most of the canister balls, the canister shot, most of them sunk into the side of the hill.
Yeah. Still,
you probably had a few strays that did make it above the hill and probably hit one of the Koreans in the leg. Mm-hmm. Now, why do I say leg and not, body, his torso or arm or anything? Well, if this had hit him in his torso, he's dead.
Yeah.
Basically. I mean, these things, if you read the accounts of in wartime, especially the American Civil War, people getting hit with canister shot, it's devastating.
Yeah, it looks like a deadly IKEA meatball.
Yeah, it would be if you tried it. Anyway, I figure he probably got hit in the leg because that would incapacitate him right away, and it may not necessarily take the leg off, but make it so where it has to be amputated. Now, one thing is that the Americans, they wanted prisoners, because in their mind they were thinking, well, we can trade these guys later on. We can get information and we can trade them.
Right.
Which is kind of interesting in the later part of the story. But at the time they thought this. But he has to be alive in order for us to trade him. So the sailors very quickly probably gave him a tourniquet and had him bite down on that bullet right there. And then they did a field amputation and then get him over to the ship so that he could, the surgeon on the ship could do a little bit of a better job of it. That was what I kind of had in my mind. What seems to have happened. Now, what would have been really great would have been if I could have found if I could have found the discarded brass or something from that piece, that would have been really a nice point also. But anyway, the Koreans, they're scattering. And then you have a whole bunch of Koreans who were kind of trapped. And like there's one, Bak Chi-sung, he was a general. He killed himself because he was trapped. So he slit his throat and went over into the down by the straits. He was actually his body was later by the Koreans later recovered and such, but you had a whole bunch of Korean soldiers who just jumped into the straits, and the current did many of them in. So in the end, you had 3 Americans killed, you had 10 who were severely wounded, but on the Korean side, you had estimates that went from 240 up to 350 Koreans killed. And because the Americans talk about the 240 were the bodies in and around the fortress. But you had numbers of Koreans who jumped into the straits trying to get away and drowned. And also other Koreans who along the way were killed. Now, you see, this is another thing that many people don't really understand is that the fighting wasn't just these forts. It was also along the way. You had the Americans going along the ridge of the hills, and you had Koreans who were shadowing them on hills that were parallel to those hills. And Koreans many times tried to take the advantage and attack, and they were always driven off by the artillery, the American artillery, and especially with the canister shot, which really put the fear in them. So they didn't try it too many times. But you still had Koreans who would have died along that way. And there's one village there. It's called today. It's called Bongomal, and it's right nearby the Sondomok fortress. It's just maybe no more than a kilometer away, and that is where a lot of this fighting went. That's where the artillery hills, the 1st and 2nd artillery hills, are located, are in this Bongomal. And so a lot of fighting happened there. And so, there were many Koreans who were probably killed in that area too. So, it was like 100-1 difference between the Koreans killed and the Americans killed. So it was a pretty devastating thing. But by the end of June 11th, it was all finished. The Americans stayed overnight at the fortresses. The next day, the American troops got in their boats and went back down the straits to their ships. The Americans stayed in Korean waters until July 3rd. And they mainly did that because they just wanted to kind of show to the Koreans and the world, I guess, at that time, that you didn't scare us off. Because they really didn't have anything else to do after June 12th except go away. But if they did that, people would say, "Oh, the Koreans chased you away," and they didn't want that, because at that same time there was a lot of unrest that was happening in China against foreigners. And if it was perceived that the Americans were driven off by these Koreans, what could happen in China? And so there was a lot of political things that were going on at that time. Now, one thing I didn't mention is where the ships anchored, which was right off the coast of Incheon. There's a very small island called Mulchido. For many, many, many years, it was called here in Korea Jagyakdo. But the Koreans gave it, just in the past couple of years or so, the Koreans gave it back its original name of Mulchido. It's about a 500-meter long island that's just off the coast of Incheon. And it's a place that in the past especially was really popular with the locals to go over, and there were some different kinds of restaurants and such, even small little things, and even they had some minbak staying places that people could even rent and stay overnight on the island. They even put a little kind of an amusement park on there at one time.
Of course.
And then back in 2012, we had that Typhoon Bolivar.
Oh yeah.
And that actually destroyed the pier. And so they couldn't have the civilians coming in there and such. Even though my colleague and I, the next year, 2013, we surreptitiously visited the island.
Okay.
Yeah, we had a fishing boat let us go over there. I had visited the island a couple times before, and the reason why is because that is where, except for Lieutenant McKee, that is where the Americans were buried, was on that island.
Oh.
There were actually 3 Americans buried there. One of them was Joseph Driver. He actually died June 2nd from heat stroke.
Oh.
So wasn't a battle death at all, but he, Dennis Hanrahan and Seth Allen, they were all 3 buried on the island, along with one Korean prisoner of war who, from what I understand, was missing a leg. So that kind of might fit into the story there somewhere.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, that island, just off that island, is where the Americans had their anchorage, and so where the gunboats would go up and down, and the 3 main ships would stay there, kind of like supply ships, such for it. But yeah, after the 3rd, they headed to China. They went to what was then called Chefu, China. Now, Lieutenant McKee's body was actually taken back to his home in Lexington, Kentucky. His coffin was lead lined because, well, needless to say, refrigeration was not such a thing back then.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it was
Superman Superman using his X-ray vision on it.
Yeah. So anyway, they McKee's body, Lieutenant McKee's body, was taken to China, where he had a funeral procession, and then from there it was put on a ship that took it to San Francisco, and then by train all the way over to Lexington, Kentucky, and then he was buried in his family plot in the Lexington cemetery. I visited there a couple of times. I visited his grave a couple of times. Very interesting. And as I mentioned to you guys, that I even have tracked down some descendants.
Oh, right.
One of them was Lieutenant McKee's, one of his descendants. His name was Jamie Wardrop. He died a few years ago. He had unfortunately had a stroke. Real nice guy. And in the very end of the 1990s, I got a hold of him. He was the family historian.
Mm-hmm.
And he even had some of McKee's, some of his belongings and such, which was very, very interesting. But anyway, Jamie and I, we developed quite a really great relationship. And in 2000, I said, why don't you come over for the ceremony they have here? It's called the Gwangsungje. why don't you come here for the ceremony, which is for the Shinmiyangyo event. And he thought that was a great idea. But first, I checked with General Jae-yun's family, his descendants. I checked with them to see if that'd be okay. And they were quite surprised, but they said, yeah, have him come on over. So Jamie came in 2000, and he met. One of the greatest things was when he met with the patriarch of the family. His name was Yun-won, and he was Yun-won was he was really quite old by that time, but he was the great grandson of General Jae-yun. Mm. And anyway, when he and Jamie met, when they met each other, they gave each other a great big hug. Mm. Neither side really knew how the other side was going to take it, but that's how it ended up. Wow. Jamie brought him over some Kentucky bourbon. They met, and it was a really great ceremony. It was one that even the family talks about to this day. Now, Yun-won's son, who is Jae's son, is his name. Is a very, very close friend of mine. He actually has he's the historian for the family, and so they have he even opened up his own little museum down in Gyeongnam in an island called Bito-sum. Oh. If you ever get down to Gyeongnam and go to Bito-sum, and he has his own little museum going there about the Shinmiyangyo, which really good. I lent him some artifacts and such to put in there, which he really appreciated. Yeah, good. So anyway, that's kind of where all this goes to.
Interesting, and I mean, we'll have to wrap up, but historically, then it was about it was 12, 13 years later, then diplomatic relations between Joseon and the U.S. were established, right?
1882, there was the Treaty of Ganghwa.
Right.
And now, of course, all of this was led up to by the Japanese. The Japanese attacked Korea. They created an incident in 1875, late 1875, that the Unhyo incident. They attacked Joseon, and especially because of the Shinmiyangyo, Korea really had lost a lot of its military energy on the island, and the surrounding regions and such. They lost a lot of everything, and they really weren't up for a fight, and especially with the Japanese. And so the Japanese were able to take great advantage of that. And so in early 1876, the Japanese forced upon Koreans the Treaty of Ganghwa, which gave the Japanese it opened up a lot of ports for their trade. It gave Japanese citizens extraterritorial rights in Korea at that time. So the Japanese are the ones who really kind of opened up Korea, ostensibly, I guess I should say, at that point. And then it was in 1882 when the Americans came back here and made their treaty with Korea, their Treaty of Amity, they called it, which just like the Japanese treaty was really one-sided. Then right upon the heels of the Americans, were all the other Western countries coming in and making their one-sided treaties with Korea. Right. So yeah.
And then it went into there, and then there's so much more.
Oh yeah, well, that's what I say. And with me, it's kind of a dangerous thing to get me talking about these things.
That's right. That's like,
because as I said, when you said about David's talk going 4 hours, I could top that. But
we should
but
Do
anyway,
not.
yeah.
No gauntlet has been thrown on that one. You don't have to do that.
Well, this is something I've been very fascinated with, as I said, for decades. So much so, that with my research, I wrote magazine articles on it, newspaper articles on it. I even wrote a book on it.
Yeah, tell us.
Yeah, there we are.
Tell us the books.
Yeah.
Tell us the books. Plug your books for us.
Okay, well, this one here, this one came about. I finished this in 2021, which was the 150th anniversary.
It looks like the title is Shinmiyangyo.
Shinmiyangyo. Yeah, it's Shinmiyangyo, the 1871 conflict between the United States and Korea. And so, yeah, I finished this one, and I really kind of had to hurry it up because it was the 150th, and I wanted to get this out there for people for the 150th. Mm-hmm. My main purpose was not to, become horrendously wealthy or something like that, because anybody who's written a book knows that doesn't happen very often. My main purpose always just to get the information out there, which is why I run my own website on the Shinmiyangyo, which I have done since I think 1999, something like that, which is called shinmiyangyo.org. Mm-hmm. But in this case here, this is spelled SIN. Well, I did the old romanization on my site was SHIN, to give the sh sound. Mm-hmm. My editor wanted to take the H out of there. So we got the H out of there.
I think that's the right choice.
So anyway, but shinmiyangyo.org, I put up a lot of the photos on there. There are some articles on there, other kinds of information. It's something I've been working on for decades, but it's still a work in progress. Mm-hmm. And then the only other thing I would mention is that I had always wanted to go into novel writing.
Oh,
yeah, and I was also really interested in like what you guys are doing, like with your graphic novels and such. Mm-hmm. I thought was really fascinating, but I haven't really gone that far yet. But I just did decide that, okay, I'm gonna, I do want to at least get some kind of a novel written that includes the Shinmiyangyo in it. Mm-hmm. And I've been working on that for the last couple of years, and it actually is going to be a trilogy when it's done.
Ooh, that's great. It's more accurate than Mr. Sunshine.
Oh, jeez.
Don't get Thomas talking about me
started. Don't get me started on that. But yeah, it's I actually have the main book finished. Mm-hmm. It's one of these things that now I need to get people to be readers and everything and go through it and nitpick it and tear it apart so I can go back and put it back together again. Right. But at the same time, now that I got that finished, I'm working on the sequel and the prequel.
Oh, cool.
At the same time. And which is kind of interesting in itself. And we'll see how that goes at a later date.
Great. Yeah, well, shoot us around if you need some readers. And if you need listeners to be readers.
Yeah, well,
you got it.
Well, if somebody's really interested in it, drop me a line and we'll look into that.
Okay. And can people contact you through the website directly? Or is there a better way?
I think I have my email on the website there. I'll have to go back and look at it now.
You don't have to give your web if it's private email. You don't have to give it on the
air.
No.
Well, I think everybody and their mother knows my email at this point. Okay. It's not that big of a. It's not a state secret or anything.
Right.
Okay.
But yeah. If anyone's interested, feel free to contact me, and I could always use some extra eyes on it.
Oh, great.
Good. Perfect. Excellent. All right. There's so much more. I think, like you're saying, there's so much information, but we'll have to probably leave it there for now. I have other questions I'm going to ask you
Okay.
myself. Yeah, certain things. Just quick, one last question, and if you can give like a short answer to it. I like it's called the just Western disturbances, or it's called an incident, and but the title of your book is the conflict.
Yeah.
And do you think, and this is something that's been in my mind for a few years, thinking about this, reading your book and things like that. Do you think a lot of the words of calling it an incident or the expedition is another simply I guess that's the official name for it by the
Well,
American
at least if you
what?
look at Wikipedia and such like
Right,
that, that's what they
right,
say.
right. Do you think those are euphemisms? Do you think conflict or even just skirmish would be a better
Well,
depiction of it?
well, and actually, this is before I came up with my title of my book. I thought exactly what you're asking me is things that I asked myself back then. What do I want to call this? It's not a war.
No.
I mean, a war is something that is declared. It's something that is it's planned. It lasts a long time. And then I was looking at the other things, like what you were mentioning, like expedition. Well, expedition again, that's really kind of a one-sided thing. It's like this side is doing it to this side,
right, right.
which I guess to a certain extent is true, but it wasn't exactly what I was going for. And with conflict is kind of academically neutral. Is why I really kind of end up. It's with conflict. It's one where both sides have their input into fighting, and a conflict is generally something that is. It's not a war. It's kind of. It's less than a war. And it's something that's undeclared. It's very often conflicts are unplanned. And so in this case, I just really kind of felt that conflict was a little bit more academically neutral. It wasn't assigning blame or anything to either side. It's just like, all right, this is the fighting that went on. When I talk about this, I very often I will refer to this as the U.S. military action in Korea. Okay, which is also I try to keep it as neutral as possible, because both sides lay claim to winning it, and both sides have their points. I mean, I think very objectively, militarily, the U.S. won hands down. They were much better equipped militarily, even though I would have to say that man to man, I think the Joseon soldiers would have stood up great man to man with the American sailors and Marines, but they were outgunned literally. So, it's one of those things that conflict. I think just it was just because it was just so neutral. It wasn't giving one side over the other. The Koreans claimed victory, and in a way they did too. Diplomatically, the Koreans never acceded to what the Americans wanted.
Right.
The Americans wanted to have a trade treaty and a treaty to protect shipwrecked sailors, and they never
screw those shipwrecked sailors. Yeah, leave them on Dokdo.
There you are. There you are. So anyway, both sides can lay some claim to victory of different sorts. So I think that neutral was the best way to go. So that's why I eventually just settled on the conflict. Yeah, the other ones they have their kind of feelings in different directions and such.
Right. Yeah, the word expedition always says, because I do a lot of mountaineering and stuff like that, and whenever I first hear expedition, I always think of the British expeditions to the Himalaya.
I think Lewis and Clark.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's exploration, and I guess that's what initially it was, but that's not what it turned into. It turned into a conflict. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, that was something that was
No Dora the Explorer.
Right.
That'd be funny.
Yeah. Okay, Thomas, thank you. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Well, yeah. Well, we went up to half a David Mason.
Have a David Davison.
That's right. You'll be happy to know that.
All right. Well,
Okay, thank
yeah, thank you. So, reminding everyone that we also have our comics, which the graphic novels you mentioned, at Dyson Comics Cafe near Chang.
Great reads.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Shawn had more to do with it than I do, but you can also order them online at darksideofsoul.com. Well, thank you so much, Thomas, for enlightening us today. We got the timing just right this time.
Thank you.
And have a great time. Until next time, everyone, stay spooky.
Good night.
Bye-bye.